Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us. So we have two guests today. One of them is with us right now. Another one is going to hopefully join up shortly. But this is kind of, I'm hoping they can give us some insight into something that we're all dealing with in Arizona and people in other states are dealing with. We had our primary elections recently, and we have Carrie Lake for governor. We have Mark Fincham for Secretary of State. People who very vocally deny the results of the 2020 election and make it kind of like a bedrock of their campaign. And so, we in the news media in Arizona, we're all covering this, but it's also a national thing going on. And so what I wanted to do is we have Leslie Dach. How do you pronounce your name, sir?
That's perfect.
Leslie Dach. We have Leslie Dach from the Defend Democracy Project. And so we're going to start off with him. And so, Leslie, could you kind of tell us what is Defend Democracy Project and who you are?
Yeah, happy to, and glad to be in Arizona for an hour. My name is Leslie Dach, and I'm the founder and co-chair of the Defend Democracy Project, a project that we started earlier this year that's focused on educating the public about the attack on our country on January 6th, the criminal conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election, and ongoing efforts to suppress the vote and put in place plans to undermine and overturn future elections. Period. We are an advocacy organization. There's no question about that. But we are not an electioneering organization. So we're not here to advocate something about the election, but we are here to advocate about the issues. I've worked on these issues before throughout the time of the Mueller report and the Trump impeachment, basically trying to elevate bipartisan voices about the rule of law in America and the need to protect our democracy. And that's what we're trying to do every day.
And you have some experience in the federal government, right?
I do. I am a Democrat. I served in the Clinton, Obama, and Biden administrations in different capacity, most recently working on healthcare. And I also have a business background. I was on the Global Management Committee of Walmart stores for many years. So I hope I bring a breadth of experience into the work that I do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, it looks like we have Norm Eisen is with us. That's great. Hello. So we're going to do an intro with him. And then, I have a couple questions that I'm going to ask them, pretty broad things. And you all are muted right now, but if you want to submit a question, you can do so in the chat and we'll kind of monitor that and we'll pull ones that, address something new or a different angle that we haven't talked about yet. So Mr. Eisen, welcome.
Thank you. I'll greet everyone from the Amtrak rail line. There has been a judge's order, somewhat unexpected one. Perhaps we'll talk about that on the underlying affidavit in the Mar-a-Lago search. And so I've been voluntold to come up to CNN in New York this evening to appear on the air, but you'll get my early and fresh views. Of course, we don't have the affidavit. I'm so pleased to be here with the Arizona Daily Star and your readers. This is like Leslie and I have spoken around the country to journalists and to ed boards in a number of places, but we have not previously had the pleasure of what I think of as the ed board writ large, which is the readers who, of course, drive any publication. So I was particularly delighted to have the opportunity, although I thought I would be doing it from the relative comfort of my own home. Mm-hmm. The club car in LA is the coffee is almost as good as my own. So in terms of my background, I'm an attorney. I was in private practice for 20 years, representing and also investigating. So I've seen both sides of the world, individuals, companies, enterprises, and political actors who either got in trouble and needed support or deserved to be investigated and prosecuted. I'm the co-founder of CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, which is about 20 years old now, one of our nation's leading watchdog groups. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. As you've heard, I'm a CNN commentator, the author of books and whatnot, and I was impeachment counsel for the first impeachment and trial of Donald Trump. Notwithstanding all of those, and I've written a ton about all these issues. Notwithstanding all of those criteria, I'm here solely in my personal capacity to talk to you today.
Okay. All right. Well, so I understand that we have you for looks like the first half of the hour, and then we have Leslie for the entire hour. So I'd like to get into your side of it a little bit first. You published this report, Trump on Trial, and I was hoping you could kind of give us like what is the gist of that report?
Well, the gist of that report was to predict that phenomena like a search warrant being exercised on the former president's home were to be expected. The report builds on the findings of a federal judge in California that the former president had committed, quote, likely crimes in connection with his onslaught on the 2020 election. That's a Brookings report. And although I'm appearing in my personal capacity, I'll summarize it by saying we found substantial evidence that crimes had been committed. I can't say that I predicted to a fare thee well that the search warrant would be executed, but we did talk about the obstruction issues. And then in some of my more recent publications, the other statutes that came into play with the search warrant. So just to summarize, former President Trump is now under investigation in 5 dimensions that we highlighted in that report. There's an investigation that the federal judge also analyzed of Donald Trump's likely crimes to obstruct the proceedings of Congress on January 6th. There's a grand jury on that, we know. There's a grand jury on the pre-January 6th activity, particularly the false electors. The first one is 18 U.S.C. 1512. The second one is 18 U.S.C. 371. There's a third grand jury looking at these document issues. There's a very active state investigation of Trump for what he did in Georgia that has been in the news every day, including today. And then finally, there's the civil investigation and the criminal one that are still going on in New York, where we just saw the former president take the Fifth Amendment. And then in one branch of that investigation, the civil branch, the criminal branch, his former CFO, Mr. Weisselberg, just pled guilty to tax crimes, tax frauds at the Trump organization. That's the large lay of the land.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
If I could say something just about the January 6th hearings, because they really, a lot of the evidence came out through there that fleshed out Norm's charts. But, one of the most important ones is that the president clearly knew that he had lost the election. All of his lawyers in the government told him that, including the attorney general. So much so that, many of the lawyers who advised him otherwise then, sought or seeking pardons or talked about getting pardons because they themselves too knew that they were engaged in illegal acts. And so I think that is really one of the contributions that the hearings have made by bringing forward the testimony of White House counsel and of the attorney general, for example, because intent, knowing that you're committing a falsehood, is part and parcel of committing a crime.
Mm-hmm. And in the moment we're in right now, it seems like we are going to have more January 6 hearings next month. Is that right? And then we also have this search warrant issue is ongoing. So we're still very much in the middle of this story, right?
Without question. I mean, I think the January 6th committee will be following a different pathway, not overlapping in a sense with this issue of national security. Norm's been the same. It's not, I've had a top secret SCI clearance in my government service. The notion that you would take a document home with you is just not something you would ever consider. I mean, it is so far away from normal behavior. Those documents never left secure rooms. When people carried them somewhere, they were in briefcases with locks and handcuffs. So the fact that this, it's those of us who live that way, it's just unthinkable.
Yeah. All right, well, we have a question from a reader involving the fake electors, right, which is part of this whole process. So are the false elector investigations happening in all the swing states, including Arizona?
Such an excellent question. There should be a hard look at the false elector facts in all 6 states, besides the other 6 states, besides Georgia, where you had false electors. Unfortunately, the state reactions to those have been variegated, and we've seen no place where there's the same kind of activity and I think strong impetus that the DA in Fulton County, Bonnie Willis, has shown. But we're going to be writing about that. That's going to be a topic of the successor to Trump on trial. Will be working through those issues for the states one by one. And the first one will be coming out in just a couple weeks. I just turned the draft. So if you've enjoyed some of the other writings, we'll have the first one will be assessing the criminal and civil lay of the land in Wisconsin, and we'll go through the other states as well. And we certainly plan to cover Arizona because while the facts are different in the different places, certainly in many of the states, there was the same very concerning conduct that has led the Georgia DA to send target letters to the false electors in that state to tell them that there's substantial evidence of crime and they may very well be charged.
And have you done Arizona? Have you reviewed what happened here? Do you have any insight you can share with us?
I'll hold my Arizona analysis. I have looked at Arizona. It is not, there are a couple of states that are lower down on the risk profile. Arizona is not one of them. So there are significant issues with the false electors, with the question of whether or not they complied with state law, not just with potential criminal liability, which we will analyze, but also potential civil liability, whether they can be sued civilly for things like civil fraud. We'll address that question and look for that publication to be coming forward early in the fall.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Curt, I'm not a lawyer, but I like to play one on Zooms. And I think to Norm's points, 2 things. One, but there's a question of whether these things should be investigated by prosecutors. Because look at the process in Georgia and all that it's uncovered through normal investigatory procedures, subpoenas, a grand jury of people's peers. So that's an important step where it hasn't happened. It's not necessary that we know, all the facts may not be known today, but meeting the burden for an investigation of that nature is quite important to finding the truth.
Well, here in Tucson at the Arizona Daily Star with our, letters to the editor and guest opinions, as I imagine is happening throughout a lot of the country. We had the January 6 hearings, and that was just kind of like boom. The Trump January 6, all that is now back in the forefront of everybody's minds. And then we had this search warrant in Mar-a-Lago. I certainly feel it, that it's just like, I feel like we've been transported back to, 2018 or something like that. And we have a question from a reader along these lines of, and it's all that everybody talks about now. We were we're starting to have interesting conversations in our pages about climate change and things like that, and it's just being blown apart. So the question is, how do we as citizens counteract conspiracies that continue to rob the common air of oxygen?
Oh, that's a great question.
Uh-huh.
I think it takes all of us individually first to realize how significant these threats are. I think one of the concerns that I know that I have is that people are bothered by them. I can go through the polling later, but really these are extraordinary threats to democracy that, if we don't take seriously, are quite problematic. So on the one hand, and the historians have all showed us this pathway to losing our freedoms and how it works. So on the one hand, people do really need to be outraged, because without outrage, I think the path is not good. At the same time, people need to engage in the process, and the elections is the place where the rubber will meet the road. Again, I'm not going to I talk about the attributes of the folks that are running, but we need to, and the public believes people should be held accountable. So those who were engaged in trying to overturn an election of 2020 that they knew they lost, and those who today are putting in place ways to do that again, that's where accountability needs to happen. That's what people have to decide to do. They have to decide that this issue is important enough for them that they don't want people representing them who will take away their right to choose their own leaders. I mean, that's really where this meets the road. People should be civil about it. We should not resort, to violence as we've seen others do. This is a question of having a strong belief in exercising it on election day.
And that's kind of like the citizen level of, what's the point where we decide that we're going to, investigate or talk about different things or whatever. But I wanted to ask Norm that there was a similar decision with the first Trump impeachment trial, right? So I was wondering if you could tell us, you were a co-counsel with the House Judiciary Committee. Could you kind of tell us a little bit, what was the thinking about, do we impeach or not? Could you just kind of tell us what the process was?
Yeah, the story, I am not here to sell books, but if you are curious, I wrote a book about this very question, among others. This is one of the animating questions. It's called A Case for the American People. And I talk about how there was not really a consensus to impeach before Bob Mueller's report came out. And then Bill Barr misrepresented and distorted the contents of that report. And the report showed compelling evidence of 10 counts of obstruction of justice, in my view, that would have normally triggered impeachment proceedings, but Barr distorted it, spun it. Don't take my word for it, because 2 federal judges have said as much in litigation over the Mueller report, one a Democratic appointee, one a Republican appointee. It was truly outrageous. But that was a big setback for us, because Barr's lies filled the information space for weeks, and he had sucked the air out of the balloon by the time the report actually came out. Congress would not have impeached Trump, but for the fact that he did the same thing again. And that is a more general answer on the accountability side, including when do we break with our usual pattern of not going after former presidents? It's when you have the repetition of the conduct again and again and again. And he did something very similar relating to abusing Ukraine, violating the law in his engagement, and then lying about it in his engagements on Ukraine. In essence, to illegally pressure someone for in violation of his public duty, in that case, the president of Ukraine, to make misrepresentations. Very similar pattern. And and the impeachment did not succeed. We did get one Republican vote, Mitt Romney. It was the first time in American history that a senator had voted in an impeachment against the president of his own party. And so then Trump did the exact same thing again, as I write in the last chapter of the book. That's what the January 6th events, the election overthrow, election denial, and the big lie were all about. And I predict it in the last, if you look at the last chapter of the book, I say, this is what's coming next, and here's what has to happen. Unfortunately, it did happen. Biden won by enough. I say this in a nonpartisan way. If Trump had legitimately won the election, I would have been the first to say that must be recognized, and then to call for impeachment. In fact, I worked on the Trump transition. So I counseled, advised the first Trump transition. So that's a subject for another day. And that's the reason that we must move now with these criminal investigations, because this will just keep happening and happening. My latest book, Overcoming Trumpery, again, truly, I'm not here to sell them. My latest book, Overcoming Trumpery, talks about the greatest danger is not just from Donald Trump coming back, it's from all those who've learned malign lessons from his tenure. Mm-hmm. That is my answer.
Yeah, great. So one thing that's come up in our letters to the editor since the search warrant is they want to know like the political motivations of investigations, and they're drawing a comparison with Hillary Clinton's emails in the 2016 election, and they're saying that like there was a different process for her than for Trump, and I was wondering if you should shed some light on the differences in those situations.
I don't want to hog all the microphone.
Well, we're going to do
Leslie,
more.
do you want to answer that one first?
I get my turn.
And,
well,
and I'll go after.
Yeah. Well, we should remember that there was quite an investigation of Hillary Clinton. It was done, and that many people believe in some ways and I should say, for disclosure, I worked on the Hillary campaign, but that the actions of the FBI by Mr. Comey and the way he talked about that investigation and then reopened it cost her the election. Mm-hmm. So, that I think that, and at no time, I should say, then people were upset with Mr. Comey, but nobody was calling for violence. Nobody said to defund the FBI. And so I think it's the reaction that's as interesting as what happened. But let's not forget that she was heavily investigated. Uh-huh. And the future president of the United States, Donald Trump, spent most of his time saying she should be locked up. Mm-hmm. So I think that people should pay attention to the fact that, yes, she was investigated in a serious way by the FBI, but also to pay attention to the reaction that people had. They were mad, mm-hmm. but they never called for violence. Mm-hmm. They never called to defund the FBI. They never went after individual agents or judges along the way. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, man. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to see if Norm had something to add.
Norm, you want to?
No, I'll remind people that there was a search of Huma Abedin's home at the end. That probably was there was an FBI search. That probably was the dispositive. The results of that search probably were the dispositive factor, and the announcement of that search the dispositive factor. That in that case, unlike this one, there was no pattern of refusing to turn material over. The material was properly turned over. Here we have a pattern of going again and again and again. And apparently an allegedly false statement was made that all the classified material was turned over, and it wasn't. So that's different. Mm-hmm. Anyone who knows Merrick Garland, I've had the privilege to know him for over 30 years. He's the least political. I mean, everybody was angry at him until the search because he wasn't doing enough. So this had to be really egregious for him to approve it. And I think the evidence was egregious, and we're going to find out, because the search warrant that has so discombobulated my travel today, this release of the affidavit, so unusual to get that in an early basis, even redacted as it's going to be, is going to tell us a lot about the evidence. I don't think it's going to be very flattering for the unique and dangerous circumstances here. That's how I would answer the readers, in addition to Leslie's very expert analysis. If you can't tell, I just love working together with Leslie on these calls. He's such a wonderful colleague. I can't believe that we never worked together on anything between us. We have more than well over a half century in Washington. So I really do agree with his initial analysis.
Mhm. All right, keep it on the legal track here. We have a question about, is there anything legally that would disqualify the fake electors from gaining an elected office? I am actually not sure if Mark Fincham was a fake elector or not. The question is, Mark Fincham, who was a fake elector, a member of Oath Keepers running for Arizona Secretary of State. I would have to check to see if he was, in fact, a fake elector. But the question holds though. Is there anything legally, if you are a fake elector, that would prohibit you from being an elected office?
Well, the requirements vary from state to state. It's an excellent question. It's one we'll look at, and I promise you we'll answer that question when we do our Arizona report. I know for the president, that's where we've mostly looked, because the former president was very involved in this fake elector scheme. We heard that from the January 6th committee hearings, witness after witness saying, and Republican witnesses, like your own Rusty Bowers, saying the president called me and tried to engage me in this scheme. The head of the RNC, Ronna Romney McDaniel, saying he called me, he tried to get the RNC to help. The president is not disqualified from running for office, but I would have to do the analysis on the individuals.
All right. We have another question I think is a really good one, but we're all taking this very seriously. You know, in Arizona, like I said, we have some people running who are they're running on the fact that they think that the 2020 election was stolen. And so it deserves a reaction. It deserves some pushback. But is there a chance that, like, what's the overreaction that we might have?
The overreaction, Leslie, I'll answer first, and then I'll pass to you because I'm going to go off to my 4 o'clock. The overreaction that you might have is to lose hope. And I really want to end on this note. Whatever party you belong to, and there's been a lot of people who have been going in both directions on party affiliations, like those who switch party to vote for Liz Cheney, whose loss history will view as one of the greatest wins, I think, for our democracy. This is not a partisan point at all. None of this is. Whichever party you belong to, you ought to believe, you ought to look at the triumph over the attempted coup in 2020. It was a triumph of a bipartisan coalition. And above all, as I wrote on the last page of my book, of the voters who would need to turn out and make themselves known in a referendum on which would we have, democracy or Trumpery. They chose democracy, and they did it in sufficient numbers that he couldn't overthrow it. If it had been closer, that coup might have succeeded. We can do that again. And the press is doing a good job. The Arizona press, the Arizona Daily Star, all of you doing a good job of tracking, exposing, calling attention to this, as well as those who support it, calling attention to them so that choice is clear. So the biggest overreaction would be despair. If we're hopeful and we turn out and we work on this and we talk about it and we do enough of these Zooms with readers of papers and the media, that's why I'm on the train tonight to go talk about these issues live on set. If there's enough of that, we can triumph again, but it's a very big danger. And underreaction would also be terrible, because we've got to turn out, including at the ballot box, as if our democracy were at stake, because it is. And Arizona is one of the most dangerous places, because you don't have some of the checks and balances that exist in other places. All right, friends, thank you so much. And I'll pass to Leslie for the rest of that answer. Thanks, Curt. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I really appreciate that.
All right, Norm, see you on TV later. I think two things in thinking about it. One we've discussed, which is an overreaction would be for anyone to think that violence is the way to move our country forward. We've seen far too much of that. I believe obviously that in the political arena, this is now coming really from the Republican Party. That's what our polling shows people are believing. But violence is not an answer to our disagreements. And I think you get people really edging very close to that line and crossing that line. Mm-hmm. We see it in the threats to the judge, in the search warrant. That's not a way to resolve our issues. Mm-hmm. To me, it's quite worrisome and hard to put back in the box. Mm-hmm. Once it emerges. So I think that's one particular thing. And the other, I agree with Norm. I do think this is an existential threat because if people lose faith in our democracy, that really goes in all sorts of terrible places. Mm-hmm. That's why I think we have to maintain that belief, and people need to take the time to vote, and then they need to respect the will of the people. Mm-hmm. Failing that's the other part of the overreaction. If we lose faith in our institutions, right. That's not.
Yeah, I mean, there will be a test in November, right? There's going to be a vote that's going to be counted, and then we're going to see what happens afterwards. I have no idea what's going to happen after that election.
Well, I think to your point there, this will be, I think, an unprecedented, litigious post-election season. Mm-hmm. I mean, we've seen, I don't know if this happened in the Arizona primary, so forgive me, but in other states where counties have refused for weeks to certify the vote. Mm-hmm. In just normal times, it didn't even matter. We see in Kansas on the abortion referendum, and we can leave, for a second, the merits of that aside, but a substantial, margin. Mm-hmm. And people saying the thing was rigged. So we've now entered that being a normal. So I think one thing, unfortunately, we'll see is a lot of efforts to overturn an election or to keep it from being finalized by people who feel that they lost. And we know, unfortunately, it in Arizona. We know it because of the Rusty Bowers refusal to do things and the people who are pressuring that. So this has been so far pretty one-sided and pretty intense. Mm-hmm. And it's going to get more intense now. Mm-hmm. So I do think we should, particularly in your business, strap yourself in for a unprecedented post-election day situation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's going to be very, very important, because how we, the election is one piece, obviously. How making sure that it is certified properly is another. Mm-hmm. And then people's reaction to that certification is another. So I think, unfortunately, for those of us who work in elections, we're not going to have the day off. Sure. After the election day is over.
Yeah, and more than likely the 2020 election, I remember watching that play out, and it was just like days, of just tension. And I assume this time around, or it's particularly in 2024, but this time around as well, like we're going to have a period of ballots being counted, and it's kind of uncertain, and then there's going to be a winner announced, and it's going to be, tense.
It's going to be weeks, of this, and it could be very ugly weeks. Mm-hmm. So I think that will be very new and very unfortunate. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the longest time we've had of that, of course, was in 2000. Mm-hmm. In the presidential race, but that was done, peacefully. Their tempers flared at times outside the counting booths and things like that. But mm-hmm. There was a very peaceful transition of power. Mm-hmm. People were disappointed, but they lived up to their obligations as Americans to do that.
Well, that was, I think, in large part because Gore said, "Fine, I lost." Right?
Yeah. Which, of course, we know from the January 6th hearings, that on January 7th, from the outtakes of the statement video that Trump made, that he even then, after January 6th, after it had been certified, after the attack on the country, that he made them pull out of the script that Joe Biden won the election.
Mhm. So, yeah, you're in Washington, you kind of are looking at the country as a whole. Have you seen any place or any technique where misinformation has been effectively combated, where it looks like, yeah, the people, got the information, the true information they needed?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, in some sense, the hearings are a good example of that. I think that people have changed their minds, or at least open up their minds through the hearings. And that we actually see, we just completed this set of polls in 6 states, and the country is remarkably alike in a way. Post the hearings, about 60% of the American people are, bothered. The word we tested was concerned, but, bothered by that. There are about 37% of the people who just believe where Mr. Trump is, that they're there, can't be moved. But in general, 30% of Republicans and 60% of independents, and of course, a large number of Democrats, but somewhere around 65% of the American people is very concerned about what they saw. Those numbers were lower. So I think, people, and the vast majority of Americans say they paid attention to the hearing in one way or another. So that's an unusual communications vehicle, but it is a communications vehicle, that worked. And I think the other thing that has to happen, because it's, as you know, very hard to break people out of their information feeds. Their information feeds narrow them down. But I think this is an obligation that sort of our elected, politicians have to stand up and actually be brave. And that's, of course, Arizona. You were lucky enough to be represented by one U.S. senator who did that, and who people had a lot of trust in, and whose voice mattered. Because when he spoke, it mattered. That Romney voted for impeachment. And I think that's another thing. We need people like that to step up. And I think they're very hard to find. I mean, when I've done this work, I've talked to a lot of Republican officials who agree with you on the phone, but won't take the public stance because they're part of they have their own tribe. They want to be a lobbyist. They want to, but we need people like that to put country over party and country over themselves. And we saw that in these hearings with these 2 remarkable women who did that and testified. We need more of that in order to, I think, accomplish what you said, to crack the tribes that we're all in.
Yeah, and I just want to note that we get letters to the editor, from local readers who are Republicans who are also upset about the lies about the 2020 election. It's not a monolith, by any means. There's definitely reasons.
And that's what I said in our polling too, we see 35% of Republicans quite concerned. So look, and those are the people too who need to exercise their views on election day, because that's where those elections will be decided.
Yeah. And I just want to, I'm seeing some people with their hands up, and if you can put your question in the chat, and then it'll filter through. We're not going to be, calling on people right now. Let's see. We are getting a good number of questions.
Good.
Well, I really just want to ask you is, again, from that national perspective, how does Arizona look? How do we fit into the national picture?
Yeah. Well, on the one hand, Arizona gets a lot of political attention because you both have an open Senate race. People paying a lot of attention to, of course. And then you have a senator who is right at the crux of whether or not there would be a reconciliation bill, or now the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So I think Arizona overperforms its size when it comes to the space it occupies in the national political conversation, for those two reasons. The only state smaller with a larger preponderance of attention would have been West Virginia because of Mr. Manchin in terms of. So I think it plays an outsized role, and I think again because of the history of Senator McCain as a legacy,
Mhm.
that is a, kind of meaningful. It's a brand of politician coming from Arizona that's known to everyone in America.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and that also, I think, is part of who you are at the national level. I think in terms of this election, obviously, there are three, you both had members of Congress who were part of the attempt to overturn the election. We talked about pardons according to press reports. So there's a lot of it, that you stand out that way. There's only really a handful of states in which that's concentrated, where there was more than one or two members. And then also the nature of the three winners on primary day.
Yes, right.
Obviously, there are one or two other states like that. It's not alone, but this is truly a bellwether because you have folks who are, basically making this, as you said in your as part of your introduction, this is what they're running on.
Mhm.
It's a strange way to run. It's a way to show your ideology, not a way to solve the problems of the people of Arizona.
Mhm.
Really, it's not addressing inflation. It's not addressing the high cost of healthcare. It's not addressing the border for folks who. It's not addressing wages. And so it's an unfortunate place to run an election, but you've got three people who are running it right there.
Yeah, you kind of touched on this, but yeah, we potentially could have a governor, secretary of state, and attorney general who all adamantly say that the election was stolen, and who knows what they're going to say about the November election. Are there other states that have that same, like boom, 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 the top three?
Yeah, I'd have to go look back at my notes,
Okay.
but there are some, like I think Michigan. I don't want to be held totally accountable for this, but I think Michigan may be one. But yes, there are some where basically there are three, the candidates for those, at least for the governor and the attorney
Mhm.
and the attorney general or the secretary of state are the same. And there are some where you might trade in. Not everyone has a senator because it's more, it just depends on kind of the, who's up that year. So, but having the rack up of the three state officials, there are one or two others,
Mhm.
but you have a senator in there too. So that makes it a little bit more special.
Yeah, he's got some subtlety to what he's saying, but yeah.
Well, I think that's the other thing we find is that, the politicians are politicians and they look to, be sure they say what they need to say to get the support of the 37% who are Donald Trump's diehard allies
Mhm.
and show a little bit of difference so they can appear to get the independent vote. Hopefully people will see through that.
Mhm.
I mean, one thing we've learned about Mr. Trump is that he demands pretty outrageous fealty to his cause. So people don't seem to escape the orbit very far, despite claims that they might. And anybody who basically says that the election was stolen in Arizona, after all the reviews, the facts, Mr. Bowers, his sticking, him standing up and losing as a result of that. Anybody who still believes that, in my mind, is not fit to hold office, but certainly can't be counted on to have a fair appraisal of other issues.
Mhm. Well, we had some questions that I think might flow right back into the Defend Democracy Project, talking about people standing up, right? So, how do you make it so people stand up, and how does standing up become transformative
Yeah,
to actually be effective?
it's another great question. I mean, I think it requires, first of all, people find they want company. It's harder to stand up alone.
Mhm.
It's easier to stand up when other people are standing up with you. So, that's one of the things that we have, people like me and people on other issues have to make it easier for people to do that. Some people stand up and they redact their, like if you're in the Ukraine, you stand up, but you don't give people your name, or
Mhm.
you just hide your identity because you can't, you're so scared of the retribution. But I think for the most part, we have to convince people what's at stake, give them some company,
Mhm.
so they're not doing it alone, and give them some psychic reward because they may suffer economic penalties, or they may suffer other kind of penalties in the associations they need for their business or in their politics. So also people, I mean, and Liz Cheney's, somewhat of an example. She chose to stand strong.
Mhm.
She lost this election, but she has a lot of support from around the country that I'm sure gave her the strength
Mhm.
to do this. So I think it takes kind of a village, a social fabric,
Mhm.
for
Yeah.
people to be brave.
It's one thing I would add is that like I think the value of the January 6 hearings and the value of Eisen's report is that they just bring it all together. You know, it allows like the person, the public can now see a story, you know, as it played out. Because I think one of the things with news related to Trump since, you know, the escalator is that it's so chaotic and it doesn't really make sense. And it's hard to like look back and be like, what exactly happened then? You know, it's just this, I think this is the flooding the zone, you know. It's
That theory. Yeah. I agree with you. And I think, look, I think your profession, you know, has more to do in this election cycle than because, you know, we everyone is about, you know, what's aboutism. Another, we're just trying to say Hillary. It's just, you know, just like Hillary, it's just like this, it's just like that. You know, the president's, you know, an expert at this. President Barack Obama took 33 million pages along with him, even though there was no truth to that. So I think that, you know, this is a time also, I wouldn't say it's a test of bravery for the press, but it's a test of sort of, you know, in a sense, reporting in a different way and doing more fact checking, all things untrue than ever before. So I think this will be you know, even more important that the press, quote unquote, do its job and call those things out. And I agree with you, Nassab, you know, is that, you know, we have to piece it together in a story. There's an overwhelming amount of news. It's to use a little bit of an example, like nobody knows what's in the Infrastructure Act because there's too many things in the Infrastructure Act. So Americans can't grasp. It's not fair to ask them to grasp a bunch of unconnected things. I think we all have an obligation to kind of tell a story that's true but simpler.
Yeah, just as a quick tangent on that note is, you know, we talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, the infrastructure bill and all that, and it's a bajillion dollars, you know, being spent. And I feel like if it was like in the bill, you know, $80 million is going to go to add a lane to I-95, you know, outside of Baltimore. It's easier to grasp, but instead it's just like this huge amount of this big pot of money. And there's no story in there that for people to grasp because it's just
and that's why, you know, they used to put up those signs. This hot, you know, this bridge brought to you by the American Recovery Act or the American Rescue Act. No, we have to do a better job telling, you know, giving people a story they can hold on to, and one, to your point, that touches them in their daily lives. I mean, I think that's why, again, this is, you know, I work a lot on healthcare. Well, the reason why that is in some ways that, you know, in all the polls, the most popular provision of this law is because it's, you know, when people get sick, that's what, you know, that's a big deal in their lives. And paying to get healthy is beyond a lot of people. So, you know, it's a real thing in people's lives. This seemed to abstract to them in addition to being complicated, and I think it feels abstract. And one of I think the obligation on all of us and you all as storytellers and us in trying to talk to the American people is how do you make it feel not abstract? And that's where you get to, I think, you know, when you say that people are going to take away our freedoms or they're going to take away our ability to choose our own leaders, that can feel very abstract in a real life. You know, people sometimes, need to talk about that. If they succeed, these, you know, other freedoms will be taken away from you. And I don't want to give a television commercial. So, but, you know, but I think we have to make it simpler. We have to make it a narrative, and we have to make it meaningful in people's real lives. And that's.
And I want to, just from my own perspective, but we're getting questions about just like how the media covers things. And I just want to give my observation from my perspective is whenever there is something Trump related, people love reading it. Those will be the highest rated, the most read stories on any news site in the country. And so that, you know, that's a lot of eyeballs. That's a lot of ad revenue. That's, you know, that's the incentive in at least part of it. And I just want to point out, like with the search warrant in Mar-a-Lago, Every morning I go check the wire, right, for the opinions that are put out from all over the country, and it is immediate. As soon as the search warrant, as soon as a big Trump news thing happens, it is just floods.
Right.
Everything. It just dominates. I bet you if I looked at the wire right now, 90% of what's in there is related to Trump. And it is a difficult battle. And I don't really learn anything from him. It's just Trump stuff. But it just takes over completely.
Yeah. And I think that we probably can't fight that. I guess all of our obligation is to figure out how to narrate it in a way that is truthful, and that isn't, I think the truth here is pretty clear. We have a lot of untruths that get a lot of time. But I agree. I think the press cannot just report. The press has to kind of define as well.
Yeah, and we have a little quick message in the chat, asking about if there's any Trump supporters on this Zoom, and if there are, I would love it if you would ask a question, and counter arguments are very important, but it also I don't know if there are. This is a very this is a Democrat liberal dominated conversation. So I think it's really good. I think it's for people to have an expert on hand to kind of explain the larger issues to us. It's very valuable. But if we don't, you can see the divide right here.
Yeah.
So, and I have someone brought up something. I think we're about to wrap up. But this is a very good question. Viktor Orban. He was at CPAC, and he is and I think Tucker Carlson had a show in Hungary a little while ago. Do you have any insight into what is the value of Viktor Orban in the conservative sphere? How do they see him?
Well, I think they see him as a person who espouses the same values in Europe, which is seen as a kind of a bastion of liberalism, and he speaks out against that. He's also creating, he believes in creating a country of one nationality, where the press has where the free press is in significant danger, and so I think he's a model for certainly what Donald Trump thinks is the way to govern. So I think that's why they like him, and they like the fact that he isn't a Democrat, still in a democratic country, but rules it the way he does. So I think it's a model for folks. I know we have to wrap up, and I've worked hard to kind of, in a sense, not to be electioneering, but I do urge if people just do need to get out and vote. And certainly, people can guess where my sentiments are about this, but this is an election where I think if people don't turn out and vote, and we don't put an end to the big lie, and we don't put an end to the reliance on violence, this country will regret that for many, many years.
And in our recent primary here in Arizona, I think the turnout was 34, 35, 36%, something like that, of registered voters. So we still have an enormous part of the electorate hasn't spoken yet. So we'll see what happens in November.
Yeah. We need them to show up.
Yeah.
And of course, we haven't talked about how some of the same folks engaged in the big lie are purposely making it harder for people to show up.
Yes, that's an enormous issue in Arizona and other states as well. Yeah.
So when you rack these up, making it harder to vote, getting ready to overturn the election afterwards, it's a pretty messy thing.
All right. Well, did you have was that your final thought? Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that's it. I hope people take this seriously. I hope they're deeply concerned about what we've seen, that they're deeply concerned about the candidates who continue to press these themes, and that they show up, exercise their vote and their democracy on election day.
Okay. All right. So I think that is going to do it for us. If there are any other last minute questions, we could do that. But if not, I think I am going to end it here. So thank you so much for joining us. It was very insightful. Very much appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you, Curt. It's been a pleasure.
And then also I want to thank all the readers, for showing up. This has been great. And thank you so much for your questions. That really helped out.
Take care.
All right. Goodbye.